All right, so you just heard on the news that a celebrity took a plea deal and you're just thinking to yourself, well, what exactly is this plea deal or plea bargain? Don't worry. In this video, I'm going to tell you exactly what a plea bargain is and the different kind of plea bargains that people can go into when they're charged with a criminal case. Coming up. Hello, my name is Clyde Guilamo and I am a lawyer in the Chicagoland area, and in Law Talk for non-lawyers, we talk about the law in plain English. And in this video, I'm going to tell you all about a plea bargain or plea deal or plea agreement. It's called different things by different people, but it's the exact same thing. Alright, so a plea bargain is essentially an agreement between the defendant and the prosecutor, okay? And in exchange for the defendant pleading guilty to a crime, the prosecutor is going to usually give the defendant some kind of reduction based off of their guilty plea, okay? Now, before we get into the specifics of why this happens or the benefits on both sides, let's talk about why this procedure is controversial, alright? Because a lot of people dislike this procedure, okay? And the number one reason why this procedure is controversial is because I talked to you about the two sides of a plea bargain, the defendant and the prosecutor. The one side that's often left out is the victim of the crime. Generally speaking, prosecutors go and they speak with the victim to know what the victim's wishes are, but ultimately a plea bargain is an agreement between the prosecutor and the defendant in that case, okay? So sometimes the victim's wishes are not carried out by the plea bargain process. The other thing that's very controversial about this procedure is the fact that the defendant, the person who is accused of the crime, is having a say on what their consequences will be, okay? There's a lot of people who say, well, I don't think that that person should be able to go ahead and have input into what exactly their consequences are going to be because they committed a crime, okay? So it's a very controversial procedure that happens in criminal court. However, what you also hear is that the vast majority of cases in criminal court are resolved via plea agreement. You get a plea deal. You get a plea deal. You get a plea. Everybody gets a plea deal. And this is the reason why, okay? The benefit to the state is this: they're rolling the dice. If the jury or if the judge comes back as a not guilty, that case is done, it's over, and the defendant will not be subjected to any sentence because they were found not guilty, okay? So the prosecutor is running a risk of losing. At the same time, the defendant runs a risk of looking at an entire sentencing range, okay? And many ranges could be a small range, maybe 1 to 3 years in the Department of Corrections, but some ranges can be significantly larger, okay? There could be a 6-year to 30-year range, or there could be a 6-year to 60-year range, up to a 100-year range. Okay, so when you're looking at these vast number of ranges with a very low and a very high, that is a risk of the unknown to the defendant. So in exchange for some level of certainty, or at least to minimize the amount of range that a defendant is subjected to, there's an interest in going ahead and resolving that case if ultimately you're going to be on the lower spectrum of that range, okay? So there's benefits to both sides in resolving a case via a plea agreement. All right, now let's talk about the difference between a full plea and a partial plea agreement, okay? Or a fully negotiated plea or a partially negotiated plea agreement. Now, the big difference here is there anything left for the judge to decide, okay? So here's an example. Residential burglary in Illinois is a crime that carries a sentencing range of 4 years to 15 years on the high end, okay? So a fully negotiated plea is in exchange for the defendant pleading guilty to residential burglary, he will receive a sentence of 6 years in the Department of Corrections. In that kind of plea agreement, there is nothing left to be decided. If the defendant were to plead guilty, he will receive that 6-year sentence and he will not be subjected to the 15, 10-year, the higher end of the spectrum, okay? Now, a partially negotiated plea is one in which there is still something left to be determined. So a partially negotiated plea, given the same example of residential burglary, is in exchange for a plea of guilty, the state is willing to cap the defendant's sentencing range at 8 years, okay? So if the defendant were to plead guilty in that scenario, what will happen is he would still go to a full sentencing hearing. And at that sentencing hearing, on the low end, he's looking at 4 years in the Department of Corrections, but on the high end, he will be going up to the cap, okay? So he will no longer be subjected to the 15, 14, 13 years because the state has agreed to cap the defendant's sentence, okay? So this would be a partially negotiated plea agreement in which there is something exchanged, an actual cap to the offense that's less than the full cap of residential burglary, which is 15 years. As a quick side note, if you're getting value out of this video, please go ahead and hit the like button. It really helps out this channel. All right, back to the video. All right, so let's talk about the different kind of plea deals that can happen, okay? So in exchange for a defendant pleading guilty, the defendant could be sentenced to something on the lower end of a sentencing range, and we kind of used that example earlier with residential burglary, okay? So if you're looking at something that has a sentencing range of 4 years to 15 years, if you have a bad criminal history, maybe because you have multiple felonies in your background, or maybe you've already committed the offense that you are currently being charged with, a plea agreement may be a fully negotiated plea agreement of 6 years, which is a specific sentence on the lower end of the spectrum, okay? So that's one of the possible plea agreements that can be entered in a criminal case. The second kind of a plea agreement that could be entered in a criminal case is a bargain on the charge. So let's go back to that residential burglary, a class 1 felony here in the state of Illinois. One of the possible plea agreements is in exchange for the defendant pleading guilty, the state will reduce the charge from a residential burglary, which is a class 1, down to a burglary, which is a class 2. Now, one of the benefits of doing that kind of exchange is because a class 2 burglary has a different sentencing range than a class 1 residential burglary. Residential burglary has a sentencing range of 4 years to 15 years in the Department of Corrections, whereas burglary has a sentencing range of 3 years on the low end to 7 years on the high end. So by reducing it from a residential burglary to a burglary, the defendant has received a substantial benefit, and that benefit is reducing the risk of receiving a longer sentence, something in the 8 to 10 to 15 range, okay? So that would be a bargain on the charge, where in exchange for the plea of guilty, the state has agreed to reduce to a lesser included crime, that of burglary instead of residential burglary, okay? So that's another kind of plea agreement that a defendant could possibly enter. All right. A third kind of plea agreement or plea deal that a defendant could possibly enter into is one in which there are different collateral consequences and not necessarily a lesser charge. Now let me explain, okay? Now let's look at an offense like domestic battery. Someone who's convicted of domestic battery, there are certain things that have to apply when domestic battery is the conviction, okay? And one of those things is you cannot receive supervision on a domestic battery. It must be a conviction here in the state of Illinois. So that's a collateral consequence of someone being found guilty of domestic battery. In addition to that, the amount of time that someone's on mandatory supervised release, previously known as parole, is also different if someone is charged with a domestic battery, okay? So a plea agreement might be that the person pleads guilty to battery. And that kind of plea agreement is one in which it's the same exact class. It's a class A misdemeanor as the domestic battery, but the collateral consequences are much, much different, okay? Another example of that would be like an offense like a sex crime. Let's just talk about criminal sexual abuse, the class 4 version, okay? That is a crime that will make you report on the sex offender registry. Now, a person may choose to plead guilty to a different crime, something like an unlawful restraint, because it too is a class 4 felony, but does not have the collateral consequence or the other consequence of having a report on the sex offender registry, okay? So these are kind of pleas in which the person is not necessarily pleading to a lesser included crime, okay? Because in both situations, the crime that they are actually pleading to is of the same caliber or the same class as the crime that they were charged with, but the other crime does not have all the baggage that the original crime had. All right, and lastly, let's talk about alternative programs. One of the things that a person can plead guilty to is some kind of alternative resolution to their case, often known as either diversion or second chance probation or first offender probation. But these are some of the alternative programs that courts have in order to address certain kinds of individuals. Now, generally speaking, the people who qualify for these kind of programs are just that, first-time offenders, people who deserve a second chance. It's not for your repeat offenders who get access to these programs. But essentially, one of the benefits of completing one of these programs is that they keep a felony conviction from going onto your record. One of the things that could be involved in these kind of resolutions is drug treatment or mental health treatment, or maybe community service, or engaging in some kind of GED or education program. These are routinely done as a form of an alternative resolution to a criminal case. Oftentimes, if there was a victim involved and there's restitution that needs to be paid, restitution is made part of this alternative resolution, okay? So if a prosecutor is offering some form of alternative resolution, something that does not involve pleading guilty and being sentenced as a criminal, these kind of alternative resolutions are some of the best plea agreements that could possibly be entered into by a defendant. All right, so not everyone gets a plea deal. How come everybody getting a plea deal except me? Okay, I want a plea deal too. You got a plea deal? You got a plea deal? Everybody got a plea deal. I want a plea deal. How come I can't get a plea deal? And the number one reason why someone does not get a plea deal is because the state is looking for a sentence at the harsher end of the spectrum. And if that's what they're looking for, then they're not going to be making a plea agreement, because their goal is to pretty much drop the hammer in this case. Another example of why the state will not make a plea agreement is when the evidence of the crime is so overwhelming that there's a good chance that there's going to be a finding of guilt, regardless if the defendant pleads guilty or takes it to trial. And the number one case that I'm thinking of that kind of fits this category are your driving on a suspended license. When they have the dash cam and it shows you behind the driver's seat of that vehicle, those cases are pretty much very strong cases for the state. So there's really not a need for the state to go ahead and negotiate those cases when all they have to do is push play and then there you are committing the crime, okay? So those kind of cases that have a significant amount of evidence, or cases that are very significant and the state is looking for something on the higher end of the spectrum, those are going to be cases in which the state's not making offers. So what do? Well, the first things first is always get a good experienced lawyer. They are going to be walking with you along this process, okay? And I actually have another video that talks about things you should consider when hiring a lawyer, and I'll link that in the comments below. But the second thing that you could do is this, okay? You can either take the case to trial, which is an option, or you can enter what is called a blind plea. And the reason it's called a blind plea is because you will be pleading guilty not knowing what the sentence is that you are receiving. Okay, so if you enter into a plea of guilty without having any assurances from the prosecutor, you will go to a full-blown sentencing hearing in which anything along the spectrum is available to you. If it's a probational offense, you can get probation. If it's an IDOC case, you may be getting the Illinois Department of Corrections if you live here in Illinois, okay? So what blind plea means is just that you are pleading guilty not knowing what the judge is ultimately going to do. And the judge, within their discretion, can either decide one way or the other, okay? All right, guys, you now know all about a plea agreement, okay? You know what they are, you know the different kinds of plea agreements, whether it was a fully negotiated plea or a partially negotiated plea. You now know that in exchange for a plea of guilty, they can give a defendant an exact sentence, or they can go ahead and give a defendant a reduced charge. And there's different things that can happen with a negotiated plea, okay? In some of the best situations, that person is going to get out of there without a felony conviction or without a criminal conviction by doing one of the diversion programs. In other cases, they may be getting a low sentence to the Department of Corrections, all right? But those are the different kinds of pleas that are available out there. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Or if you have a recommendation as to what I should talk about next, I would more than happily take that in the comment section below. All right, take care, guys. Bye-bye.